reach out to her for that. All right, so I am so pleased to introduce our first presenter of the season. Nathan Shirley is former president of the Asheville Piano Forum, who lives in the North Carolina mountains with his wife and kids, works as a freelance composer, performs his own compositions in the composer-pianist tradition of Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, and many others. He's written for independent film, animation, theater, and ballet. Composing for the concert hall is his primary passion, and he's composed about 200 works for children and has taught piano, including improvisation and composition to many students, including the Crescendo program, which teaches elementary students piano through group classes in public schools. And he's also the author of the 7-book piano method series, Piano Revealed. I could keep going with this presentation, his bio, but that would take up the whole presentation, so I'll let him reveal more about his many, many gifts and talents. So please welcome Nathan Shirley.
Thanks. Thanks, Leo. Testing. So, the topic today is music in the silent film era. And this is a surprisingly difficult subject to research. There hasn't, even though it wasn't all that long ago, relatively speaking, especially for us classical music people, there's just not a lot of information on the music itself that was played for a lot of these films. And the more you read, the more you get these totally contradictory examples of what music would have been like, 100 plus years ago. And I eventually found a really good book that documents pretty much all the written information that's out there for silent film in the United States. And so that was one of my primary sources that I kind of went through to put together this. It basically, to spoil the ending, it basically paints this picture that there was no standard music for silent films. It pretty much, anything you could think of was probably being done. And there's this idea that gets thrown around a lot that silent films were never silent. But even that's not true. A lot of times silent films were shown without any music or sound whatsoever, especially early on. But some theaters just didn't have the budget, especially rural theaters way out in Montana, didn't necessarily have the budget to even hire a pianist. But anyway, I'd like to take a step back and do a quick survey, because basically the silent film era it only existed because of a technology gap between sound and images. If you go way back through history to the dawn of humanity, it seems likely that people were always trying to create images of the world around them. So, whether it was early humans drawing in the sand or in the dirt with a stick, or eventually evolved into cave paintings and things like that. And eventually, of course, to Da Vinci and other artists. And meanwhile, it's almost impossible to say, when people started to try to record sound, but one of the most obvious things is recording language. And so the spoken word was probably the first thing that people tried to record by writing down. And so you get the pictograms early on that sort of evolve into cuneiform and some of the early written languages. But in my mind, that's kind of the beginning of people trying to write down sound. And nobody really knows when the first attempts to write down music were. And there's probably millions of artifacts that are completely lost to time. But one of the earliest is this. Does that look familiar to anybody? So some of you might recognize the old Babylonian first recorded attempt to write down music. This isn't exactly like a music notation. It's more like a description of how the music would have been played. And historians don't agree at all on what this music would sound like. There's some ideas that they used parallel thirds, and that it was probably for some kind of string instrument like a lyre or something. But a lot of it is total guesswork. And so to fast forward to the silent film era, you have this technology gap that I was talking about, where the images came first, photography developed first, and then recorded sound was still kind of developing in its infancy. And so motion pictures got its start before sound had really been refined in a way that could be very useful. So this might look familiar to any photography enthusiasts. This is the first surviving photograph, essentially. And it's pretty hard to see what you're looking at, but it is looking out through a window at a cityscape. A lot of the first photography experiments were done in France, and also a lot of the first motion picture experiments were done in France, and audio recording, for that matter. I should tell you the dates for some of these. So that photograph goes back to 1826. And it wasn't that long before the photograph started looking a good bit better, which I'll jump back to in a second. But what you're looking at now, does that look familiar to anybody? So these are kind of known as the very first animations, at least the first that survived and were common. And this particular one, let's see, goes back to about 1832, so not long after the first photograph. And these devices were really fascinating. They go by different names, but the most common name is if I can not butcher it, they had all these funny, like, scientific-ish names. This is the phenakistoscope.
Okay.
And the way that it worked is fascinating. So you have this disc that has the printed image on it, and there's slots that you can see going around the edge of the card. And you would hold it, and there was a thing in the center so you could spin this disc. And if you spun it, it would just look like a spinning disc. But if you spun it and looked through the slots into a mirror, then you would see basically this, except it would be flickering because you'd get black in between the slots. I don't know if that makes sense. Anyway, a very early concept for animation that would be one of the main things that inspired motion pictures to develop. And there's all kinds of amazing surviving examples of these things, like this.
Oh, wow.
You can imagine in 1832, spinning one of these discs and looking through it into a mirror and seeing something like this. A lot of people thought it was magic, and there was sort of a rebellion against it in some places. Sort of this black magic concept.
Oh, rats.
If you like rats. So yeah, it wasn't too long before photography started getting more refined. And this is an example from Germany. It's they don't know exactly what date it is, but it's somewhere in the late 1830s, most likely. And then this is the first photograph. This is back to France, in Paris. This is the first photograph to capture a human. I don't know if you can spot the human in it, but the exposures for all of these early photos had to be extremely long. We're talking sometimes days, but often hours, many hours. And so in this case, this was one that didn't take quite so long. it probably took a good hour or so to expose. But all of the people, the pedestrians would have been all over on the streets, but because they were moving, none of them got exposed, so they disappear. But this one guy getting his shoes shined way down bottom left-ish, he was still for long enough that it made some image of him. Anyway, let's see, and I think I'm skipping a video here, so I want to not forget the early audio. Let's see if we can get this. Okay. So yeah, then we get to the very first audio recording actually wasn't intended to be an audio recording. It wasn't intended to be played back. So let's see, that is, and this goes back to 1857, 1860, right in that range. So this first device was created with the intent to study sound vibrations. It basically used a cone, kind of like a phonograph, and then at the end of it there was a little needle that would kind of scratch into paper that was covered in soot, and it would scratch the vibrations of sound. And so it was just used to look at the vibrations and see if they could, notice any patterns in these sound vibrations. But the really amazing thing is one of these, at least one of these, actually survived the paper with the scratching in it. And it wasn't until, I think, 2008, that somebody came up with the idea. I'm surprised it didn't happen earlier. But somebody came up with the idea of just scanning it and then electronically, through computers, turn that into a sound wave and play it back. And so you can actually hear this sound recording from, I believe this one is 1859. The very first audio ever recorded that wouldn't have been heard until 2008. And it's very rough, but if you listen carefully, you might be able to hear a tune being sung by the inventor. Yeah, you got it. Right. So yeah. So way back in time, and it took a good bit of time before recordings got better than that. It wasn't until Edison's laboratories started to work on the early cylinders made of aluminum foil and then later wax and things like that. But they worked kind of like records, scratching the vibrations into a cylinder. But then he figured out a way to make it play back, of course, or his scientists under him did. And actually, Alexander Graham Bell beat him to it, not with wax cylinders, but with discs. So basically really primitive early records. And I've got a version of, the first recording of Alexander Graham Bell that exists. And this goes back to 1876, this recording. Again, extremely rough. You might not be able to understand what he says, but he basically said, I'll tell you. He says, "Hear my voice, Alexander Graham Bell." Maybe one more time. Hear my voice. And then what we just saw was, this is not the first of the cylinders, the Edison cylinders, but this is basically the invention. This is a later commercialized version. But you can see the cylinder would spin just like a record, except, cylindrically, and then there would be a needle to play it back. And it's kind of fascinating, these cylinders would have sounded pretty horrible, especially early on. But the wax ones were sold commercially, and so you could buy these different little wax cylinders, and they only lasted about 3 minutes of, recorded audio. So it was usually like one song, and the wax would wear out really quickly, so you could only play the cylinder back maybe 10, 12 times before it was just, a mess. And then you could actually shave off the outside. They sold like a little kit to shave it down. And then you could use this device to record your own sound on it, your own primitive sound. So that was something that, because you think of like cassettes and that as far as mass media or mass consumer recording products. So pretty far ahead of its time. And then of course the phonograph and records didn't have that feature for the most part. So let's see, let's go back here. Then we get to the early first attempts at motion pictures. I'll start with, I can get this one. Oh, this one's silent, that's fine. Okay, so I don't know if this looks familiar to anyone. This one's kind of a famous image, but this dates to 18. Let's see if I get it right. I think it's 18. I got this mixed up. My bridge. Oh, here it is. 1878. And the story goes that there were a couple guys that had this this argument over when a horse is running, is there ever a point in time when the horse's legs are completely off the ground, or does the horse always have at least one leg touching the ground at all times? And they hired this this inventor, Muybridge, who devised a set of cameras along a racetrack to take pictures of a horse while running, and then look at each frame and see if the horse ever had its feet off the ground. And so the way he did it was along the track, he set up some strings that were basically little tripwires, just at even increments, and then each one was attached to a camera, take a shot as the horse ran by. And so there's I don't remember 16 or so images, but when you he noticed that when you looked at them kind of quickly one to the next, that you almost got this sense of animation going. And he eventually came up with a system not too far removed from the early animation systems like that disc that spins or the zoetropes that you look into spin. And he was able to insert his photographs into that and then create this early motion pictures. Not quite a film camera that you think of with movies, but it was an important step in that direction. So let's keep going. There's so much here, I don't want to spend all the time going through the history, but it's kind of important just to set the scene. Let's see. I'll skip a little bit of this. Well, maybe just real quick. This is kind of fascinating because, okay, this is the very first true motion pictures example. And it's very short, it's just looped. It's about 2 seconds long, and it's just looped so that you can see what you're looking at. And this goes to, now we're getting a little further along, 1888. And this is from France. Louis Le Prince So he invented basically the first self-contained film camera. And Edison is often credited for doing this, but his was quite different and actually technically came a little bit later. Louis Le Prince was in the process of trying to get a patent on this, and he had toured around a little bit in Europe, but he needed to go to New York to really exhibit it and get enough eyes on it in the patent world in order to establish his patent. But he was on a train in France shortly before he was able to make the trip to New York, and he just disappeared. And nobody knows what happened to him. There was no trace. There was no motive known as far as anybody could say, except his wife believed that it was some of Edison's goons that knocked him off.
Wow.
Who knows? Not too long later, Edison got the patent on motion film cameras. And then there was a lawsuit between another French company and Edison's company. Louis Le Prince's son testified in that over some of the technical details. And then he wound up dead with a gunshot wound.
Oh, wow.
Again, unexplained. There's all kinds of crazy stories behind Edison, but nobody's been able to piece together for sure on this, so it's speculative, but interesting. And so anyway, once these first film cameras started coming up, there was a lot of interest from artists to use it for interesting art forms. But for a while, it was pretty heavily controlled by Edison and the Lumiere brothers in France, who developed their own separate camera a little bit later. And both Edison's team and the Lumiere brothers were more scientific minded, and so the types of films they were releasing, and Edison had his own film studio at the time, but they were basically releasing newsreels, so they would shoot things about current events, and then somebody would stand there and talk and explain what was going on. A little bit later, the first films that were being shown, again through these two groups, were travel films. So they would go and film the Alps, and then somebody in the theater would stand there and talk about why you should travel to Austria and see the Alps, that sort of thing. Meanwhile, there was a pretty famous filmmaker who, I'm skipping over a little bit, but I'm trying to save some time here. There's a famous filmmaker that a lot of you will know, Méliès, who was really interested in getting his hands on one of these. He'd seen a presentation with the early film cameras, but he tried to buy one, they refused, and it wasn't until he was able to purchase a projector, because the projector system started to become common for small theaters, Nickelodeons, and places like that would show films. He got his hands on a film projector and managed to reverse engineer it, and it took him quite a while and a lot of work, but he was able to create his own film camera out of this. And he started shooting his own films, which were far and away more creative than anything else anybody had been doing at the time. And I'll play for one of those, which this one came a little bit later when he was able to purchase a better camera. And I'm sure this will look familiar to a lot of you. So, A Trip to the Moon. How many of you have seen this one? Yeah. Okay. So, A Trip to the Moon, I believe it came out in 1908. So very early on still, back when silent films were not at all standardized in any way. They were all short films still at this point, just because there was no good way to change out massive reels. There was some experimentation in that, but not a lot. For the most part, they were pretty short films. I've cut down this one a little bit because there's a lot of slow bits. Also, notably, this is in color, not because color film existed yet, but because Méliès had eventually developed a method for hand coloring every single frame of the film. And so he would have these teams of women that would just go frame by frame. Each one would paint a different color. Yeah, they probably weren't paid well. But they would just go frame by frame, each one painting their one color, and then they'd pass it down the line and they would paint their color. Thinking about that is kind of overwhelming when you think of the thousands of frames in even a really short film like this. But those films wouldn't have been shown except at the biggest theaters that could afford to rent the color films. So there were also black and white versions that went all over the place. And these were incredibly popular everywhere, really, around the world, including in the United States. And it was really these Méliès films that kicked off a more creative period in silent film history. So let's dive into A Trip to the Moon. And I'll play for this one for you. It's all shot like a theater play.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that brings me to the next topic of what musicians would have done for films like this. And
Nathan, excuse me, what year was that film done?
1908, I'm pretty
'Cause-
sure.
So they knew that rockets could go up and they'd be coming back down
Well, of
into
course,
the
there were no
ocean.
rockets.
I know, but
exactly
I mean, it
per
was
se,
like
but-
almost, somebody really thought about it.
Yeah.
How would the rocket come back, you know?
Eventually, like,
Yeah.
some
Yeah,
reminds
it-
you of modern times, because the rocket went up and it came back down, and it had an ocean lane.
Yeah.
So that, you know,
It's kind of
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, there were scientific, writers like Jules Verne and
Oh, that's
people like
right,
this
yeah.
coming up with
Yeah.
these interesting ideas.
Yeah.
I was just gonna ask what the filmmaker, what kind of drugs was he on?
It's kind of wild how these French film directors were so different from the American film directors. Later on, some of the Americans got a little more adventurous with things. But considering how early Méliès was doing this, it's pretty wild. Yeah, it's pretty wild. And some of the other European films were more experimental too. But for the most part, people were not doing that kind of thing. But yeah, Méliès was doing these trick edit shots and stuff from even the very beginning. In fact, he got the idea for doing that where you stop the shot, move the actors, start it back up again. He got that from just a frustrating moment when he was trying to film a cityscape and his camera jammed up and he was trying to figure out what was wrong with it. It took him like, a few minutes to get it going again, and then it started recording again. When he developed the film and looked back at it, he noticed that, there were horses moving over here and people walking this way, and then in a split second, all of a sudden it was different. The same cityscape, but different people, different horses. And that's where he got the idea to do some of those.
You have to think, if it's 1908, it's the Victorian period in
Right.
America. Women weren't even supposed to
Right.
show their ankles.
Exactly.
They had
Right.
shorts,
It
gals
was
in
a
shorts.
different world in Paris.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really advanced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this film became a huge hit, even in the United States. I'm sure it ruffled some feathers along the way too, but fascinating. So yeah, getting into the music itself, it's really hard to research the different types of music that would have been played just in the United States. But when you go outside of the U.S., it gets even more difficult. There probably needs to be a lot of, and there probably are some, I just can't read, all these different languages, but there haven't been, as far as I know, any translations of studies that were done on silent film music from, Japan or from Latin America. There's little bits you can find here and there, which paint a very interesting picture. But to focus on music in the U.S. real quick. So at the very beginning, you had these Nickelodeons that were set up. Nickelodeon is kind of a weird term because sometimes it's used to describe a box that you look into and film plays. These were the early Edison films. In fact, for the most part, Edison's studios were creating films that you would look into some kind of device to see the film. So you put in a nickel and then watch a 2-minute little movie clip. And in France, they were actually projecting the films. Later on, the projection won out and they went everywhere. But sometimes Nickelodeons are referred to being these devices. Other times, the term is used to refer to actual theaters that were developed to show early films. And so you would have, paid your 5 cents, 10 cents, whatever, however fancy the theater was, and go in and sit down and watch a short film. And so some of these were totally silent without any sound, but a lot of the higher end theaters started realizing that the clatter of the mechanical playback was so loud and unpleasant that they needed a pianist to cover it up. So they bring in piano players and other musicians to play whatever music they wanted to kind of cover up that sometimes there would be, like I was talking about with the travel films, a lecturer. So that was very common to have somebody that would just read a script while you were watching this silent film. There were some attempts to make early mechanical music playback, like kind of like a music box system. And so those were used more for these little Edison devices, boxes and things, and didn't really catch on because there was no great way to make it sound big in a room for a live audience. And so as far as the styles of music that would have been played, also sometimes they would have a singer hide behind the screen, and there would just be a recording of a song, somebody singing a song on a stage, and the singer would sing, and it may or may not match up that well with the lip syncing, but you know, that was, yeah, bad dubbing, yeah, exactly. And bit by bit, the piano became the most common form of accompanying for these films. A lot of the musicians early on came from vaudeville, and some of the old vaudeville theaters were used to show films too, especially right after the Nickelodeon period started up. And so the vaudeville music could also have a huge range to it, but a lot of it was popular tunes at the time, ragtime, things like that, show tunes, popular songs. And a lot of musicians at that time still improvised, something that kind of died off in the classical world at least, but you know, back then pretty much any classical musician would have been improvising too. So the music was heavily improvised, heavily just whatever popular music that musician knew they would play. And as the film studios became bigger, there was this real frustration that the music was so inconsistent. And so you get these funny little anecdotes of people complaining about the musicians playing some happy, popular tune during a funeral scene, something like that. And apparently that sort of thing was super common. Other musicians would have done a great job, I'm sure, but I'll read a little bit. Oh, and the other thing that started becoming popular, there were some percussionists that would do sound effects for films. So if there was a horse walking, they'd bang on a coconut to make the hooves sound, and they'd open and close doors and things like that, sometimes behind the screen, sometimes just off screen. And so one combination that became pretty common early on was piano plus a drummer. And there's all kinds of accounts of people complaining about the drummers. They call them
Nothing new about that.
overactive drummers, trying to do sound effects for everything. And there's some pretty funny accounts I'll read. This is more about a piano player doing music that was inappropriate, but this is a woman recounting, the mother had died in the film, and it was very sad, and they were standing there at the graveside, and my stepmother was playing the piano. The end of a perfect day. And then there's this is about a more drummer sound effects person. Percy is the name they're going by here. So Percy is a real wonder. When there's water in the picture, it goes to Percy's cerebrum. If there is a lake shown on the screen, no matter if it is a mile away, calm or stormy, he shakes his box of peas so that we may know that it is principally made of water. Bow wow indicates that we are looking at a dog and not a doormat. And he is a master of such startling effects as clapping 2 blocks of wood together when an old nag, candidate for the glue factory, trots along a country road. But Percy's star act, the one that gets a laugh, is his imitation of a baby crying, no matter whether the one on the screen is nursing or merely dying. And you get a lot of these like bizarre old accounts of things like that. And then here's another one about, let's see. It is almost funny to observe the diligence which some prop workers watch a horse when he comes into the picture. Every step is caught with a keenness that soon attracts the attention of the audience to the horse's feet and away from the actors. The lover may be pleading with the squire's daughter to elope with him, during which the horse is grazing in the background, but nevertheless, every step that the horse takes must be faithfully recorded by a loud pop on the coconut shell, without regard whether the horse be walking on ground, gravel, granite. So lots of things like that. Let's see. Gonna go through these. There's a little cartoon of, someone dying and they're on their deathbed and the pianist is playing this happy upbeat tune. And eventually, as time went by, you get more and more different instrumentalists playing for these silent films. By the way, if somebody could keep an eye on a clock for me.
11:20.
What's that?
11:20.
Okay. I'll try to finish up here so I can get to the last film. So bit by bit. Oh yeah, thanks. That's perfect. So bit by bit, more and more instrumentalists would try their hand at accompanying silent films. And for some of the biggest theaters, like in New York City or San Francisco, some of the big Paris, they would sometimes have a full orchestra or a chamber orchestra in most cases that would play along with these films. The problem was there really weren't many film scores being written. So sometime, like when the first films were being released, there wouldn't even be any indication as to what kind of music should go along with the film. Later, once you get into about the 1920s, when the silent film era was really in its heyday, then sometimes, not always, sometimes a director would make notes like, for this scene, maybe play Beethoven's Pathetique. For this one, maybe play Chopin's Funeral March, things like that. But it was generally still vague, with some exceptions, and I'll go over a couple notable exceptions. And so these theater orchestras would often have sort of a library of musical clips, musical notation clips. So they would have something for a fast upbeat scene. They would have something for a sad scene, something for a scary scene. And then it would often be up to the conductor to piece that together for their orchestra to play. And eventually it became popular to sell books of musical ideas to sell to pianists in theaters so the pianists could go through, pick out ideas and kind of improvise around them, but use those as the meat of the different films. And a lot of those, the most popular books, started being used once sound film came around, and so you hear a lot of those old tunes in the early sound films as well. Some of them go back to the vaudeville days, in fact a lot of them. But it was pretty rare to have a dedicated score written for a silent film until the later part of the silent film era. And then it was usually just the biggest budget blockbusters that would have a score written. And even then, the scores were pretty much some kind of collage of a little Tchaikovsky, a little Beethoven, a little vaudeville. But the studio companies were really frustrated. I think I mentioned that with the inconsistency of all these musical performances. And so they made this effort to try to educate musicians and get them to play more classical music and less popular music. Things like that were pretty common. And so this is kind of an interesting shot of a theater chamber orchestra. You've got the mighty Wurlitzer in the center, which became very popular in some of the big theaters later on. You've got a piano in the center, it's a little hard to see, and then you've got your winds and percussion over on the right side. Here's a little chamber group. And so again, there'd be no standards to any of this. Does anybody recognize these guys? So, on the right, Charlie Chaplin. He was a violinist, played cello too. You might notice he's playing with his left hand. He had his violin strung that way. And then Buster Keaton is on the right, on the left, sorry, with him. And so Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, and Harold Lloyd really became very dominant in American silent films, especially in the 1920s. Comedies, for the most part. And their comedies spread all over the world. So you could see a Charlie Chaplin film in Colombia, South America, or in Japan, or just about anywhere. And the music that would have been played would have been completely different depending on where you were. After I played for one silent film, I talked to this older gentleman who told me that his father, he was from Colombia, South America, and his father played in a traditional dance band, and they used to play for silent films all the time, just playing traditional Colombian, dance music. So if you were seeing a Charlie Chaplin film down there, it would have been entirely different. And unfortunately, there's really not recordings of any of that, since the audio technology still hadn't caught up. We still have this incredibly primitive, rough audio. And that's also what made possible these jobs for all these musicians to play music. Meanwhile, the studios were also really working on trying to develop better audio technology so that they could do away with all the problems with musicians and ship a film with a recorded soundtrack. There's Charlie Chaplin with, anybody know? Stravinsky. And then we'll get to this in a second. So let's see. I'll just talk a little bit more about the types of music. So it would have been common, like I said, to hear vaudeville sort of music, popular music, ragtime. Some musicians exclusively played popular tunes that they knew. There were the drummers and piano. There was this term that was later coined, Mickey Mousing, which relates to pianists that would play sort of every single, I do some of this myself, play every single sound effect as a musical idea with the piano. And of course the early cartoons, the Disney cartoons and others, were using the type of music that would have been common in a lot of the American comedies at the time. So some classical music, some goofy music, some popular tunes, folk tunes, things like that. And now to go to some of the exceptions real quick. These are kind of fascinating. I'll go through them quickly so we don't run out of time here. But we've got, if we go to some of the other countries especially, you get these interesting exceptions. So I'll do Eric Satie. Eric Satie actually composed music for a film, but he did it before the film was made. And so if you're familiar with Satie, he had this concept, I think later on in his life, furniture music, where it was meant to be sort of background music that wasn't supposed to be listened to, but it was sort of the early Muzak, I guess. He's ahead of his time with that. But he wrote in that style. He called this his furniture music for film, basically. And the way he wrote it was he just wrote these kind of repetitive little musical ideas that could be repeated any number of times to fit a scene. And so the director then went back and kind of cut the music so that it fit the film. And Satie makes a cameo appearance in this film. This is 1 year before he died. In fact, let's see if I can. This is just a clip from the film, but it's a short film. Early animation. Let's see if you can spot Satie. Another bizarre French movie. This is Satie's Dada, sort of. That's Sati in the hat on the left. Well, they jump around in slow motion for a while. I'm gonna go ahead and all right, and then let's go to just real quick. This is George Antheil's Ballet Mécanique, which he composed this for a silent film, again, that hadn't been created yet. And he created a score that really, there was no way to make it work in practice because he wrote it for 16-player pianos, all to be synchronized. But at the time, there was no way to synchronize player pianos. And so, talking to the director, they both agreed, like, yeah, this is probably not going to work. He had written the music, and then the director went on to make the film anyway, but without this music. But later in time, people were able to recreate the music and put it together. And this is even more wild, but typical experimentation from the 1920s. He's using a siren, all these like percussion sounds. You wouldn't see this in the United States. Speaking of drugs. Anyway,
Was that in France?
yeah, that was. And then a lot of people don't know this. I didn't know this actually until I was researching it. Schoenberg actually wrote music for a silent film, but he was very skeptical about silent films, interested and skeptical. So he never agreed to write music for a real film. This is his music that he wrote for a non-existent silent film. And Stravinsky heard one of the early premieres, and in typical Stravinsky humor, he said, "It's by far the best film score that has ever been written." And it's typical Schoenberg 12-tone. I'll just play a little bit of it. And that goes on for a while. So. Okay. And then I'll jump to one more kind of outlier, which this is sort of interesting. So Dmitri Shostakovich was a teenager when silent films were still, getting popular over in Russia and into the Soviet Union. And when he was 19, he got a job playing piano for silent films. And he really didn't like it that much, but there's this funny anecdote where one time he was performing for a Scandinavian documentary on bird migration. And the audience started booing the film after a while. Shostakovich wasn't sure if it was because they didn't like his music or if the movie was too boring. But, it's kind of funny to try to imagine Shostakovich improvising to a silent film. Of course, he was an excellent improviser. And he did write he went on to write a lot of film soundtracks, actually, but his silent film is The New Babylon. This is written right around the time of his first symphony, which sort of launched him into fame.
What year?
So The New Babylon came out, and it would have been the late 20s. I believe it was 1927, right around in that ballpark range. I'll just show a little bit of this one too. One thing that Shostakovich is really good at is matching the emotion on the screen, and so she gets this letter, she's in a, you know, depressed state. The letter's exciting and changes her mood. Again, a pretty interesting film, the way they do all these interesting lighting effects and cuts and things. And then I'll skip a little ahead because there's an interesting scene with a pianist. So this is in the middle of a war. The war's kind of died down to a lull just for a minute. Yeah. And he uses a little bit of folk music, but primarily later. The music that he composed for this film was so complex and difficult that there weren't many theater orchestras that could actually do it justice. And so the film ended up not being that successful just because of the score being too difficult. But later on, you know, people made recordings and did it justice. And then the war kicks back into full gear. Of course, Shostakovich would go on to write some incredibly famous war-inspired music. Okay, and I'm gonna make sure. So right around this time in the later silent film era, some of the studios started to make some success with audio recordings, and there was a huge leap in the audio technology thanks to the film industry trying to replace musicians. And so this is around the time that electronic microphones came out, which could record with much better fidelity than the old, you know, phonograph yelling into the tube system. And the first film to come out, there were some short films that had decent audio around the mid-20s. But then the first film to come out that actually made use of feature film to come out that made use of recorded sound was Don Juan. A lot of people think of The Jazz Singer as the first audio film, but that was actually just a little bit later. And so this is a Vitaphone, which was a device that would play these discs back along, synchronized to the films. And these early sound films give sort of a glimpse of what would have been really common in American orchestra scores. So we've got, and there's the premiere. And I'll show you just a little clip of this film. music sort of works, and it sort of doesn't. So slowly dying. And it's funny when you're reading about silent films. I'll try and say this real quickly. A lot of the silent film historians are so in love with every silent film that they can't help but just appraise everything about them and everything about the early scores that were written for them. But the truth is, I love films, but I'm not a huge film historian or anything like that by any means. So I feel like I can see it a little more objectively. A lot of the silent films are just plain bad. Just like any movie from any period of time. And there are some real gems that are like fantastic films. And the same can be said for the music too. A lot of the scores are just pasted together, kind of thrown together, second thought or afterthought. And every now and then there's some good music. And Charlie Chaplin eventually started composing his own music for his films. He didn't write down music. He couldn't really read that well, so he had assistants that would help him write down the music. And so Charlie Chaplin's scores are considered some of the very best from the silent film era. But interestingly, he also just kind of, would use some Tchaikovsky here and some other things there. But it at least fits the film pretty well in general. And let's see if I can find. So this is Chaplin's The Kid. And you might recognize the music. Sometimes you read about this and you say he wrote all the music himself. It was all original completely, but clearly not. So you've got this really heart-wrenching scene, but then the music kind of just keeps going as you've got this sort of more comedic stuff going on. And that's typical of the Charlie Chaplin scores. He would have a piece of music that fit really well for a scene, but it would go on for quite a while before it would change to something different. And I'll say one little anecdote before I play for the last film. And the jazz singer is similar. I've got a clip of it, but for the sake of time, I won't show it. It's very similar though. You've got, even though it's all about a jazz singer singing in jazz lounges and things like that, the score is mostly classical music, except for the scenes when he sings. And some people cite the jazz singer as the first sound film because it includes the first spoken dialogue. But most of it is still using title cards. It's just there's like one scene where he talks to his mother, and you can actually hear him speak. But it's sort of this half silent film, half audio film. And then once the 1930s hits, pretty much all of the films went to sound. The very first, the Vitaphones, were really expensive at first, and so they weren't practical for most theaters, but as the technology rapidly progressed, it wasn't long before all theaters decided it was more economical to go with sound films, and everybody wanted to see those anyway, and the musicians got laid off almost overnight.
Yeah.
So it was really the biggest the biggest unemployment period for musicians ever in history. There were a lot of musicians who started working just because the film industry was booming so much, and not only did it kind of fall out from under their feet overnight, but it also coincided with the Great Depression in the 30s, and then, you know, the film industry was actually one of the few things that was doing pretty decently in the 30s. So it could have sustained those musicians, but not so much. And then you get these early film composers that you'll have heard of some of their names, like Korngold was one of the early ones. Max Steiner was one. Prokofiev in the Soviet Union started writing a lot of film scores, working with Eisenstein on some famous ones. But let me not take any more time. I'm going to jump into the last film here. I just picked one of the Buster Keaton late 20s silent films, shorts that he did, The Love Nest, and I'll perform for this, for the conclusion. Doing my own take on the music, because for me, this is one of the fantastic things about silent films is it's kind of like the Baroque period where there's not a whole lot of instruction given to musicians, so you have this opportunity for artistic license. So that's what I'm going to do. thanks for coming out. Hope everybody enjoyed that.
Nathan, that was fantastic. Let's give Nathan another round of applause. And also, if you have a place to post posters for the fall benefit concert, they're right by that thing. So, thank you.
Any questions? Real quick.
I just wonder what opportunity, you said you had played for some silent films, what venues or opportunities you had?
Yeah, so I started kind of as a hobby. I started playing for some, and so I've played all over the state, and some in South Carolina and a little bit further out. At the museum, the art museum in Raleigh, North Carolina Art Museum. They used to have a film series, and so I'd come and play for some of them.
Film series is really good.
Yeah, sometimes.
It's really sort of hard to find, is it not?
Yeah.
I lived in San Francisco for a while, and I went to everything I could. I saw City Lights,
Yeah.
big audience in San Francisco playing, and it was still fabulous, and people laughed and enjoyed it, and I thought, how amazing, all these years later, that it held up as a compelling form of entertainment.
Yeah, some of the films really do still
Yeah.
hold up. A lot of the Keaton films, Chaplin.
So, that Shostakovich one that you showed that had a lot of this music,
Yeah.
that's obviously not the original sound, right?
No. It was re-recorded later with good microphones and
Yeah.
everything. And so originally the intention for that was to have a live orchestra play along with it, which again in some of the bigger cities that was done. And so now you can, if you look online, you can find DVDs and Blu-rays of a lot of the old silent films, and even there it's hit and miss if you get one with a good score. But some of them have really good scores. Others are just some generic ragtime kind of.
My parents were born in 1905 and 1907,
Mm-hmm.
and they talked about the transition to the talking movies and how everyone laughed hysterically when these actresses actually started speaking because they were so bad.
And when was this one
Yeah.
from again, this last one? When was it made?
This was 1929, so right at the end of the
United States.
in the United States, yeah.
Has anybody seen The Little Dictator, the one with
Yeah,
Charlie
Charlie
Chaplin?
Chaplin.
That's a really good film.
Yeah, he's got some fascinating
Yeah.
films.
I
Yeah.
was gonna ask, what are some of your other favorites that you like to play?
Oh,
What ones that you would recommend?
I really enjoy playing for. There's some that I like to watch more than play for, but I really like all of the Buster Keaton films are a lot of fun, and the comedy still holds up really well. And they work good for kids too. I've done these in public schools, and a lot of these Buster Keaton films are just like watching a Mickey Mouse cartoon.
Yeah, right.
And a lot of the jokes from Mickey Mouse got stolen from Buster Keaton and others. But yeah, all of the Keaton films. I like some of the weird films too, like some of the old horror films. Nosferatu's not the greatest film in some ways, but it's still fun to play for, and audiences like that one. And there's Hexen is like a strange Swedish film that I love to play for, but it's kind of a long one. There's a lot. Harold Lloyd has some great films. Safety Last. My grandmother, when she was still alive, I played for Safety Last, and she was able to make it to that showing. And she had remembered seeing that when she was a kid. So she was born in 1919, and when she was in elementary school, the school got a copy of Safety Last, and they just put a phonograph record on and would change it out when it would run out. But she remembers the kids just like shrieking with laughter as the film is going, and he's climbing the building. That's the famous Safety Last is the famous film that has the iconic image of him hanging from the clock tower from the clock hand. But yeah, there's a lot of good ones.
Have you ever heard of Dennis James? I just looked him up
That
again.
seems-
Well, I was
seems
at Indiana
familiar.
University, yeah, in the mid-70s.
I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
the big thing every year, twice a year, was coming Halloween Yeah, I just looked him up, I think he's still doing it.
Okay.
Organist, yeah.
Oh, an organist, okay,
He would
yeah.
go to Indiana University for thousands and then he sent paper airplanes up to his balcony and everything.
Oh, that's funny.
First fall I was there in 73, you know.
Yeah, so there are still some theaters that have either renovated their old Wurlitzers and get organists to play for those from time to time. I studied organ a little bit, but I'd have to spend a lot of time, so
He's great on the piano.
I haven't tried an organ.
Oh, it
Yeah.
was great.
Thanks.
Nathan, just a little bit, a few years after this, I read, Andre Previn was a studio composer.
Mhm.
And he would show up that morning and they would say, okay, we need 5 songs for filming today. And he would write the songs, orchestrate them, and then conduct the orchestra for the recording, all in that same day. And he didn't get paid for really, and he was just on a salary.
Early on,
But
yeah.
he didn't get royalties or residuals or anything like that.
Yeah, he was
It
one
was
of those Renaissance people that was
Yeah.
just pretty amazing at whatever
Like
they
you.
touched. Thanks. Appreciate it. But yeah, so thanks again for.
And anyone who can help, get chairs and tables.
There are plenty of these muffins back there, there might be still a little
Yes.
warm.